The scream didn't rise. It tore through the canyon like something being ripped open against its will. I was still holding my coffee when Bolt came charging back toward the barn. Neck high, eyes sharp, a shredded designer handbag clenched in his teeth like a captured flag. Before I could even process that, Spitfire thundered in behind him, his wool smeared with mascara and fake tan, moving with the confidence of an animal that had already finished its work. Then HOA Karen's voice hit full volume from the far side of the pasture, screeching about assault and lawsuits while she staggered backward, dragging one flip-flop and clutching her shaking Pomeranian like a legal exhibit. The entire scene lasted seconds, but it told me everything I needed to know. I didn't rush forward, and I didn't shout, because out here when alpacas respond that fast, the cause is never ambiguous. I stood there watching her flail at grass she had no right to touch, listening to her threaten consequences she didn't understand, and I knew this wasn't confusion or bad timing. This was the inevitable result of someone deciding fences were optional when they didn't like where the line was drawn. HOA Karen had crossed it again, and this time the land answered back. The only surprise was that she still looked shocked it happened. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? She kept screaming even as Bolt dropped the ruined handbag in the dirt like discarded prey, and Spitfire slowed to a deliberate walk. His job done. I could hear the panic under her words, the realization setting in that this wasn't a misunderstanding she could talk her way out of, or a complaint she could file into submission. Her dog squirmed in her arms, nails scraping uselessly against her sleeves, and for the first time since she moved in, she looked small against the open land she thought she could dominate. I didn't say a word, because nothing I could have said would have landed harder than what had already happened. She saw me then, standing by the barn, calm, unmoved, and that look alone enraged her more than the alpacas ever could. People like HOA Karen don't expect consequences to come without warning, and they especially don't expect them to come wrapped in wool. She had convinced herself that rural meant unguarded, that quiet meant passive, and that offense was just a suggestion if she decided it inconvenienced her. What she didn't understand was that every inch of that pasture existed because I made it exist, that every line was there for a reason, and that the animals protecting it were trained, not decorative. This moment didn't start with screams, and it didn't start with alpacas. It started with entitlement deciding it was allowed to trespass. I remember the way she tried to shift the narrative even then, shouting words like attack and dangerous like they were switches she could flip to reverse what everyone could see. Her voice echoed uselessly off the hills, because out here sound carries, and so does truth. Bolt stood between her and the pasture with his ears forward, not aggressive, not frantic, just present. And Spitfire lingered a few steps behind like a reminder. They weren't chasing her anymore, because there was no need. She was already retreating, already scrambling back toward the opening she had carved for herself. The humiliation didn't land all at once. It seeped in as she realized there were no witnesses she could control and no authority she could summon fast enough to save her. Her designer clothes were streaked with dirt, her confidence stripped down to raw noise, and the land remained unmoved. I could see it in her eyes when she finally looked around and noticed how exposed she was, standing in the open with nothing but accusations and volume. That was when the screaming shifted, turning from outrage to fear, and that shift told me this was only the beginning. She dragged herself back through the gap in the fence, sobbing and swearing in equal measure, and the alpacas let her go without ceremony. Bolt shook his head once, like clearing a bad smell, and Spitfire turned away with a snort that carried more judgment than aggression. I stayed where I was, because stepping forward would have given her something to point at, something to twist. Instead, I raised my coffee slightly in acknowledgement, not as a gesture of kindness, but as confirmation that I had seen everything. That small motion seemed to break something in her, because her glare sharpened, like I had committed a crime by not reacting. What she didn't realize yet was that this scene would be replayed more times than she could control, not because I wanted revenge, but because she had made the mistake of thinking this land didn't watch back. The alpacas had done what they were trained to do, and the pasture had enforced its own boundary without a single word from me. The screams faded as she stumbled away, but the tension didn't leave with her. It settled in, heavy and expectant. Because moments like this don't end conflicts. They expose them. Standing there, listening to the quiet return inch by inch, I understood that this wasn't about an animal incident or a neighborly dispute anymore. HOA Karen had made a decision long before this morning that rules were optional when they inconvenienced her, and now that belief had collided with something solid. The alpacas didn't escalate the situation, they concluded it, and everything that followed would flow from that single, undeniable fact. I didn't buy the ranch by accident or impulse, and I didn't end up out here because I couldn't make it work somewhere else. I chose this land deliberately, the way someone chooses a tool they intend to rely on for the rest of their life. 4 years before HOA Karen ever appeared on the ridge, I stood at the fence line with a post-hole digger, sweat running down my back, measuring distances by hand because I wanted to know exactly where my responsibility ended and the rest of the world began. This place wasn't about escape. It was about control, not over people, but over my own space and time. The quiet wasn't a luxury, it was the baseline. The fence mattered because it represented effort. Every post was sunk straight, every wire tensioned properly, every corner braced the way it should be when you don't expect someone else to come along and disrespect it. I didn't hire it out, didn't rush it, and didn't treat it like a suggestion. When you work land long enough, you learn that boundaries aren't philosophical concepts, they're physical necessities. Animals need them, property needs them, and people who ignore them tend to cause damage they never want to take responsibility for. My neighbors understood that without needing it explained. Most of them had lived out here longer than I had, and the unspoken rule was simple. You mind your side, you respect the line, and you don't create problems where none exist. That balance held until HOA Karen arrived with her moving trucks, her oversized house perched high on the ridge like a lookout tower, and her assumption that proximity granted authority. From the moment she moved in, it was clear she wasn't here to integrate. She was here to impose. The first interaction set the tone. No introduction, no curiosity, no attempt to understand how things worked out here. She complained about my compost pile like it was a personal offense, even though it sat well away from her house and downwind. I remember looking at her, standing there with crossed arms and narrowed eyes, and realizing she wasn't asking for accommodation. She was issuing a correction, as if the land itself had made an error by existing the way it did before she arrived. I gave her more patience than she deserved, because I've learned that people new to rural life sometimes panic when they realize nature doesn't consult them first. But patience only works when it's mutual, and HOA Karen didn't reciprocate it. She complained about the rooster crowing too early, as if animals run on her schedule. She complained about my tractor noise, despite the fact that it operated well within daylight hours. She even took it upon herself to lecture me about hanging laundry on a line, calling it unsightly, like aesthetics outweighed practicality. Each complaint followed the same pattern. She spoke with certainty, not because she was right, but because she was used to being obeyed. There was always an undertone of authority she didn't actually have, a confidence that came from environments where rules are enforced by committees and fines instead of fences and animals. She assumed that because she was loud and persistent, the outcome would bend in her favor. Out here, volume doesn't translate to power. The real shift came the morning I found the fence cut. It wasn't torn or damaged the way an animal might do it. It was clean, intentional, and wide enough for a person to pass through comfortably. That detail mattered because it removed any doubt about intent. When I reviewed the barn camera footage and saw HOA Karen casually cutting through wire with garden shears, waving at the camera like she was acknowledging an audience, something clicked into place. This wasn't irritation anymore. This was entitlement turning into action. She didn't hesitate. She didn't check. She didn't ask. She looked around briefly, as if the only thing she needed to confirm was whether anyone might stop her. And then she made her own doorway. Watching that footage, I felt something colder than anger settle in. It was recognition. I understood exactly the kind of person I was dealing with. Someone who doesn't test boundaries to see where they are, but to see whether they'll be enforced. That realization changed how I approached everything that followed. I didn't confront her immediately. I didn't march up the hill or demand an explanation. Instead, I repaired the breach temporarily, not because I believed it would stop her, but because it documented my response. I needed a record that showed I addressed the issue reasonably before it escalated. Authority isn't about yelling first. It's about standing on solid ground when the shouting starts. What HOA Karen never understood was that my authority on that land didn't come from a title or a board. It came from responsibility. I fed the animals. I maintained the fence. I knew the property lines down to the inch because I had measured them myself. The alpacas weren't decorations or novelties. Bolt and Spitfire were trained livestock guardians, selected and conditioned specifically to intercept threats without unnecessary force. They weren't aggressive, but they were decisive, and they responded to intrusion exactly the way they were supposed to. I trained them personally, using scent markers, vocal cues, and controlled drills, because relying on chance is how things go wrong. They were gentle with people they knew and alert with those they didn't. They didn't chase for sport or attack indiscriminately. They assessed, they blocked, and they escalated only if the intruder did first. HOA Karen didn't see guardians. She saw obstacles she assumed would move. By the time she returned, after cutting the fence, dressed like she was heading to a resort and kicking aside the barricade I'd placed, I already knew how this was going to play out. She wasn't there to apologize or negotiate. She was there to assert dominance, to prove that her initial trespass hadn't been a mistake, but a statement. When Bolt and Spitfire moved to intercept her, they weren't improvising. They were executing exactly what they'd been trained to do. That moment wasn't chaos. It was consequence. HOA. Karen screamed because she didn't expect resistance, not because she was injured. She tripped because she panicked, not because she was attacked. The alpacas responded to her behavior, not her identity, and that distinction mattered. I didn't step in because stepping in would have reframed the situation as a personal conflict instead of what it was, a trespass being corrected by the systems already in place. Standing there with my coffee, watching her scramble back through the hole she'd created, I understood something fundamental. Authority doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't posture or threaten. It simply holds. HOA Karen had spent her life mistaking proximity and noise for power. Out here, power belonged to the people and animals who respected the land enough to protect it properly. That was the foundation of everything that followed, whether she realized it or not. The fence wasn't just wire and posts. It was a line backed by preparation, documentation, and guardians who didn't bluff. HOA Karen crossed it, thinking she could rewrite the rules by force of will. Instead, she exposed herself to a system that didn't care who she thought she was. HOA Karen didn't retreat after that first encounter, because people like her don't recalibrate when they meet resistance. They escalate to regain the upper hand they believe is owed to them. What changed wasn't her behavior, it was her strategy. She stopped treating the ranch like a place she could physically dominate and started treating it like a problem she could bury under paperwork, authority theater, and manufactured outrage. That shift told me more about her than any scream ever could. She believed power lived in process, not truth, and that if she could flood the system with enough noise, someone else would enforce her will for her. Her first move was predictable. She went straight to complaints, the kind designed to sound urgent without needing to be accurate. Animal cruelty, aggressive livestock, shared access disputes. She framed herself as a victim of a dangerous rural setup, carefully avoiding the part where she had cut a fence and walked onto private land. This wasn't about safety, it was about narrative control. She wanted an authority figure to show up and do what she couldn't, push me into compliance by proxy. What she didn't account for was documentation. When animal control arrived, clipboard in hand and expression already worn thin, she assumed the title alone would tip the scales. Instead, it exposed her. The footage didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't embellish. It simply showed her crossing lines she had no right to cross and provoking animals that were doing their job. Authority shifted in that moment, not because I demanded it, but because facts replaced her version of events. That should have stopped her. For a reasonable person, it would have. But HOA Karen didn't see that interaction as a warning. She saw it as a delay. She pivoted immediately, leaning harder into institutional abuse. She started talking about shared trails, historic easements, and community wellness initiatives, phrases she used like keys she assumed would unlock access. None of it was real. It was language designed to sound legitimate, long enough for someone else to enforce it before checking. She walked the property line with contractors, pointed at land that wasn't hers, and spoke with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed when they said things loudly enough. When that failed, she tried again under a different name, filing zoning requests that misrepresented boundaries and invented history. Each submission followed the same pattern: authority first, accuracy optional. She wasn't trying to be right, she was trying to be relentless. Her abuse of power became more invasive when she realized official channels weren't moving fast enough. That was when the surveillance started, finding a hidden camera on my side of the fence, duct-taped and wired like a bad spy movie prop, crossed a line even she couldn't spin. It wasn't oversight or concern, it was intrusion. She wanted proof she could twist, footage she could clip out of context to justify her next move. That kind of behavior doesn't come from fear, it comes from entitlement that refuses to accept limits. When I projected her trespassing footage publicly, I wasn't humiliating her for entertainment. I was removing her ability to isolate the narrative. Power thrives in private, in closed doors and one-sided reports. Once people saw what she was doing with their own eyes, her authority evaporated. Neighbors stopped treating her complaints like isolated incidents and started recognizing a pattern. That recognition was the beginning of her collapse. She responded the only way she knew how: louder, more frantic, more accusatory. Signs went up. Warnings appeared. False claims multiplied. Each one was an attempt to reassert dominance by creating the illusion of danger and urgency. But every escalation made her less credible, not more. Authorities began to recognize her name before they recognized her story. That's when power shifts permanently. HOA Karen never understood that real authority doesn't need constant reinforcement. It doesn't threaten, posture, or overcorrect. It functions quietly, efficiently, and consistently. Her abuse relied on the assumption that systems could be bullied the same way people could. Instead, those systems documented her behavior, flagged it, and adjusted accordingly. By the time she realized her usual tactics weren't working, she had already built a record that followed her everywhere. Complaints turned into warnings, warnings turned into citations, influence turned into liability. She hadn't just failed to control the ranch, she had exposed herself as someone who couldn't be trusted with any authority at all. The fence was still standing, the alpacas were still calm, and the more she pushed, the clearer it became that the only power she ever had was borrowed from systems that no longer believed her. The moment HOA Karen realized intimidation wasn't bending reality in her favor, she shifted into something colder and more deliberate. This wasn't anger anymore, it was calculation. The kind that assumes if enough fragments are collected, something useful can be assembled later. She stopped confronting me directly and started trying to build a version of events she could deploy when it suited her. That was the phase where discovery mattered most, because every quiet move she made created evidence she didn't realize she was leaving behind. The first confirmation came with timing. Complaints started arriving in clusters, never randomly, always following moments where she had been denied access or corrected by an authority that didn't answer to her. Animal control visits, zoning inquiries, noise complaints, all spaced just far enough apart to look coincidental, but close enough to form a rhythm. Patterns like that don't happen by accident. They're engineered by someone who believes persistence is a substitute for legitimacy. What she didn't account for was that persistence creates records, and records don't care about intent. Each call was logged, each complaint time-stamped, each response documented. When officers arrived, they didn't come with urgency anymore. They came with recognition. They'd seen the name before. They'd seen the accusations before, and they were already expecting them not to hold up under scrutiny. The discovery of the hidden camera changed everything. Finding it taped low against the irrigation pipe on my side of the fence wasn't just invasive, it was reckless. She hadn't just crossed a physical boundary, she had crossed into behavior that required explanation, not excuses. The wire buried shallowly in the dirt told me she hadn't been careful. She'd been rushed, acting out of frustration instead of strategy. That was when I knew she was unraveling. I removed the device without damaging it, documented its placement, and traced the cable back to where it disappeared under the fence line. That wasn't theatrics. It was procedure. Evidence only matters if it's clean. When I replaced it with my own visible camera, positioned openly and legally, I wasn't escalating. I was clarifying. Everything from that point on would be recorded without secrecy, without ambiguity, and without her control. The projector was never about mockery, despite how it looked from the outside. It was about exposure. By displaying her own actions exactly as they occurred, without commentary or editing, I stripped away the one advantage she relied on most: selective storytelling. Neighbors didn't need explanations. They saw her cut the fence. They saw her trespass. They saw her provoke animals and then retreat screaming. Proof doesn't argue. It convinces by existing. That visibility had consequences she didn't anticipate. Once people recognized her behavior as deliberate rather than accidental, the tone of every interaction around her changed. Contractors refused to proceed without permits. Officers asked questions before responding. County clerks checked records before processing requests. The system slowed her down, not out of malice, but caution. Her attempt to rebrand her intrusion as a community wellness project was almost impressive in its audacity. Filing under a neutral-sounding name, invoking health and access, and referencing non-existent historical easements was a classic misdirection play. It failed because history leaves records, and records contradicted her claims completely. When the county rejected her proposal, they didn't just deny it, they annotated it. That annotation followed her next submission. Every step she took to regain control added another layer to the file of building around her. False claims turned into nuisance flags. Surveillance turned into harassment concerns. Trespass turned into documented incidents. She had created a comprehensive record of her own misconduct without realizing it, convinced that if she just kept pushing, something would eventually give. What finally broke her momentum wasn't confrontation. It was consistency. Every authority she tried to weaponize responded the same way once the evidence was laid out. Calm, neutral, unmoved. They didn't side with me because I was loud or angry. They sided with facts because facts didn't shift under pressure. By the time she understood that proof had replaced perception, it was already too late. The narrative no longer belonged to her. It lived in footage, reports, timestamps, and corroboration. She wasn't being misunderstood anymore. She was being recorded. From that point forward, everything she did only tightened the net she had built around herself. Once the proof was no longer private, the conflict stopped being personal and became communal. And that was the moment HOA Karen truly began to lose control. She had always relied on isolation, on confronting people one at a time, where her confidence and volume could overwhelm them. Public scrutiny removed that advantage completely. Every move she made from that point forward happened in full view of neighbors, authorities, and a growing number of people who had already seen enough to stop giving her the benefit of the doubt. Her first public confrontation came when she tried to force construction onto the pasture under the assumption that contractors would listen to whoever sounded most official. A white pickup rolled in with magnetic signs slapped on the doors, 2 workers stepping out with tool belts and blueprints, already uncomfortable before they even crossed the line. She stood nearby, clipboard in hand, posture rigid with performative authority, explaining that the path was approved and that access was a community right. She spoke loudly, not to convince me, but to convince the witnesses gathering along the road. I didn't argue. I didn't shout her down. I simply asked the contractors for permits. When they hesitated, Bolt appeared at my side, calm, but unmistakably present, his body positioned squarely between them and the pasture. Spitfire followed, stopping just far enough back to make the point without advancing. The workers didn't need instructions after that. They backed away on their own, muttering about liability and supervisors, leaving HOA Karen standing alone with her clipboard and a narrative that had just collapsed in real time. That moment marked the shift. Neighbors who had watched quietly before started speaking openly. Questions were asked. Phones came out. HOA Karen's protests sounded thinner, without an audience willing to nod along. She raised her voice, insisting this was harassment, insisting she was being targeted, insisting the community needed protection. None of it landed. When authority figures arrived, they didn't rush to her defense. They asked her for documentation, for clarity, for explanations she couldn't provide. The sign war that followed was pure desperation. She planted warnings at the fence line about vicious animals and community danger, complete with flashing lights and alarms meant to provoke a reaction. I responded with a single sign of my own, professionally printed and unambiguous, stating private property and the consequences of trespass. The contrast was stark. Her sign screamed panic, mine stated fact, the neighbors noticed. Her attempts to file harassment complaints backfired almost immediately. Officers who had already reviewed footage watched the projector display without comment, then turned to her with questions she couldn't answer. Each call she made brought someone who already knew her name. Each accusation she leveled returned with scrutiny instead of sympathy. The public nature of her behavior stripped her of plausible deniability, and without that, she had nothing left to leverage. The collapse accelerated when even her own allies began to distance themselves. Contractors declined work. Neighbors stopped responding. The HOA board, previously content to ignore her antics, started fielding calls they couldn't dismiss. She had become a liability, not just to me, but to anyone associated with her claims. Influence evaporates quickly when it starts costing other people time and credibility. Her final attempt at public confrontation came during an event she tried to disrupt by force of presence alone. She arrived uninvited, shouting into the open air, waving her phone like it was a weapon, threatening to record and report everything she saw. The sheriff was already there, standing casually, watching her unravel in front of an audience that no longer took her seriously. When he told her to leave or calm down, she did neither. She stormed away instead, defeated without a single argument being raised against her. That was the moment it became clear to everyone watching that HOA Karen had lost, not because she had been overpowered, but because she had been exposed. Her authority depended entirely on people believing she had it. Once that belief vanished, everything else followed. From that day on, her presence felt smaller, her voice less commanding, her threats hollow. The collapse wasn't loud, it was visible, and it happened right in front of the community she had tried so hard to control. Once HOA Karen's public authority collapsed, what remained was a quieter phase that most people mistake for peace, but is actually consolidation. This is where experience matters, because when someone has spent weeks abusing systems, the correction doesn't come from noise, it comes from alignment. I didn't celebrate her unraveling or push for a dramatic finish. I shifted into containment, making sure every avenue she had used to harass, intimidate, or fabricate was sealed methodically. The first step was clarification. I contacted the county offices I had already dealt with and requested written confirmation of boundaries, permitted uses, and complaint status. Not because I needed reassurance, but because documentation has weight long after emotions burn out. Each response came back clean, unambiguous, and official. Property lines confirmed, no easements recorded, no permits filed, prior complaints logged as unfounded. The more she had tried to overwhelm the system, the more precisely it now defined her limits. Animal control followed up without prompting. They didn't announce it, didn't make a show of authority. They reviewed records, closed the file, and flagged her name internally. That flag wasn't punitive, it was preventative. Future complaints from her would be treated with verification instead of urgency. That single procedural adjustment stripped her of the ability to weaponize panic. It meant that if she called again, the system would slow down instead of react. Zoning took a similar approach. Her attempted filings, including the Wellness Project and the alleged historic access claim, were annotated and archived. That annotation mattered. It meant future submissions under her name would be cross-checked against prior misrepresentations. Bureaucracy doesn't get angry, but it does remember. Once trust is gone, every claim is weighed instead of assumed. The retaliation wasn't visible because it didn't need to be. It lived in quiet confirmations, updated databases, and procedural friction she couldn't push through anymore. When she tried to file additional online complaints under different phrasing, they routed back to the same offices that already knew her history. Each one generated less response than the last. Eventually, they stopped generating any response at all. Even the HOA distanced itself, without confrontation. A board member reached out privately, not to apologize, but to ask for clarity. I provided timestamps, footage references, and correspondence logs without commentary. The next meeting agenda quietly removed her from any advisory relevance. She hadn't just lost influence, She had become a risk they didn't want associated with their name. What struck me most was how effective restraint turned out to be. I didn't threaten legal action. I didn't demand punishment. I simply made sure that every system she had tried to bend had accurate information to resist her. Expertise doesn't shout. It positions. Once positioned, it lets structure do the rest. HOA Karen attempted one final maneuver by filing anonymous reports through public portals, accusing me of hosting unauthorized gatherings and misusing agricultural land. Those reports triggered inspections that lasted minutes instead of hours. Inspectors already had the permits. They already had the footage context. One of them joked that they felt like they were double-checking a locked door with the key already in hand. The final procedural blow landed without spectacle. She received a formal warning for misuse of reporting systems, a notice that further false submissions could result in penalties. That letter did more damage than any argument ever could. It didn't accuse her of malice. It documented a pattern. Patterns are harder to escape than blame. From that point on, her behavior changed, not because she learned restraint, but because she ran out of leverage. She could no longer summon authority at will. She could no longer create urgency where none existed. Every route she had relied on now led to a dead end. The retaliation was complete, not because she suffered publicly, but because she was neutralized privately. Her power didn't transfer. It dissolved. The end did not arrive with an announcement, a confrontation, or any kind of acknowledgement that something had gone wrong for HOA Karen. It arrived quietly, in the way real endings usually do, when there is nothing left to press against and nowhere left to push. One morning I stepped outside and noticed the ridge was empty. No pacing, no binoculars catching the sun, no movement that didn't belong. The absence was complete enough that it took a moment to register as final. A moving truck showed up a few days later. Not early, not dramatic, just another vehicle on the road that didn't slow down when it passed my gate. Boxes went in. Furniture disappeared. Her husband moved stiffly, eyes down, like someone who wanted the process over without conversation. HOA Karen never looked in my direction. Sunglasses stayed on. Her dog stayed zipped inside a carrier. She didn't posture, didn't threaten, didn't try one last time to reclaim ground she had already lost. She simply avoided being seen. There was no celebration on my end, no satisfaction to savor out loud. I leaned against the fence and watched from a distance as the house emptied itself of noise and tension. When the final truck backed out, it clipped the edge of the fence she had once cut. Not hard enough to break it, just enough to rattle the wire. The gate shifted slightly and swung open on its hinge. Bolt and Spitfire stepped forward together, unhurried, stopping at the threshold like it was an old habit. HOA Karen screamed from inside the vehicle, the sound thin and useless, and the driver accelerated without stopping. The alpacas didn't pursue. They didn't need to. After that, the ranch settled into itself again. The pasture healed without intervention. Grass filled in, soil compacted where it was supposed to. The fence stayed untouched. Days passed without incident, and then weeks, until HOA Karen's name stopped coming up entirely. Not in meetings, not in conversation, not even as a reference point. She didn't become a lesson or a warning. She simply disappeared from relevance. Authority returned to its proper place, invisible and unchallenged. No officers stopped by, no inspectors called. No complaints filtered through digital portals. Systems moved on to other problems that actually existed. Bolt spent more time lying in the shade than patrolling. Spitfire stopped watching the ridge entirely. Animals don't pretend peace. They only accept it when it's real. I didn't add more signs. I didn't reinforce the fence beyond what was already necessary. Overbuilding would have implied fear, and there was none left. The boundary held because it was respected again, not because it was contested. That distinction mattered more than anything else that had happened. Some evenings I stood on the porch and watched the sun drop behind the hills, the same stretch of land HOA Karen once had treated like a shortcut. Nothing crossed it. Nothing tested it. The silence stayed intact. HOA Karen went silent. Nobody argued after that. The scream didn't rise. It tore through the canyon like something being ripped open against its will. I was still holding my coffee when Bolt came charging back toward the barn. Neck high, eyes sharp, a shredded designer handbag clenched in his teeth like a captured flag. Before I could even process that, Spitfire thundered in behind him, his wool smeared with mascara and fake tan, moving with the confidence of an animal that had already finished its work. Then HOA Karen's voice hit full volume from the far side of the pasture,